One wrap-up, final tagline to what we were talking about regarding how the uncertain, and only the uncertain, is necessary in the secondary world. I would just like to remind you regarding that general approach of thinking more than you have to and the kind of particular methods of always asking just one more question. That kind of method of the continual why. I would just like to point out that you might consider how you could use this yourself to assist in your own private use of intellectual uncertainty in pursuing whatever individual aim you had. It is the prime way out in the ordinary world, just mechanically, just through the absolute force of nature, of life itself. You have the uncertainty being the life's breath and the continual requirement for the secondary world to survive. But there's always a difference between that kind of collective effort that men are doing intellectually for life itself, for its own interest, and that which an individual might do for his or her own interest. And one way to do it is to, in a different way, it's a different level, a different intensity, because there's a different purpose of you keeping intellectual uncertainty alive inside of you. Is where of course, thinking more than you have to, and where the direct method of always asking just one more question, not of other people, although I point out how there is an external reflection of that and the kind of apparent tangible dance you could do verbally with somebody else when you always ask them one more question, in the same sense that all adults love for a child to do that. I mean, it's a way to make friends in the city, being somewhat funny, ha. But to be able to do it with yourself, it's not that you just literally have to say to yourself, well, I believe I understand this, but I will be sure to ask another question. You don't have to do it that way. You can look at it conversely, is that you just simply never allow yourself to put a period. Even if for whatever reason you're not interested right then, you're tired, you've got something else to do, or you don't see what other question to ask. That you see something and it seems to be refreshing, you had a new way of thinking about something, and it seems at the time satisfying. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's always that you're operating on the basis that there is no such thing as the sacred in the secondary world. That just because this is great, but if you know anything by now, all right, if you know two things by now, then one of the things you know is the first thing that you ever knew that was different, you now see that you didn't know everything there was to know about it. Not from any particular view, not because it is written down somewhere that you've got to go through a process, but from your own view, from your own thinking of it, that you first saw the light. And then the second thing you saw was, boy, there's more light than I thought. So life itself at a strictly primary mechanical vivus machina level is going to run in uncertainty. That is what keeps the secondary world alive. But at that level, it's of no use to an individual. I mean, it's going to happen, and you're going to benefit from it if you want to look at it that way, the technology, the movement of medicine and everything else in the secondary world, based on uncertainty, based on it always being inconclusive. But that has no effect. That cannot be used by somebody attempting to neurally rebel themselves. You just can't. It's of a different quality. It is collective. It is serving the interest of life, no matter how it may apparently be engaged in a kind of trickle-down theory, as they like to call it, and it may benefit you and everyone else, but it cannot be used to pursue your own individual interest. To do that, you have individually got to keep uncertainty alive, and you got to do it for you. You've got to do it specifically. We'll consider that a wrap-up of that little subject. Now I was wondering, rhetorically speaking, would anybody be interested in how about a variation of the top 40 disc jockeys? I was first inclined to come up with some kind of new off the cerebral wall description of a major breakthrough in strides in biology. We could either do that, or, as I was thinking, a variation of the top 40 disc jockeys. How would you like a blast from the future? A newish station. Of course, a blast from the future, and what you understand intellectually, is always operationally, in fact, already an unseen past master at directing what's going on now. How was that? All right, consider biological serious insurrection. It's already happening, and we have been sort of talking about it for months and months and months and months. The subject is the fourth primary. It is the fourth S. And without any doubt, you surely by now, no one can deny it either here or anywhere else. It is a fair description that we obviously have at the primary level the three basic requirements, the three S's of sex, shelter, and sustenance. But for modern comprehension, for modern measurement of the secondary world, there is now the absolute need, if you're going to see much further, to include a third S besides sex, shelter, and sustenance. It is nowadays it is a fourth primary requirement, and it is speech. Rather than just saying that, which I'm going on in different ways, and I think all of you will begin to see it on your own, but how about let's take what even appears to be, even though it's some of our own description, it would still fly out in the academic ordinary world, that speech, as nebulous as it may strike you as first, or you may take it metaphorically, me saying it is now a primary requirement on the same level as sex, proper food, sustenance, and shelter. Even using our own description, I could come up with an operational way in which it meets the unique requirements of the first three S's. Again, you keeping in mind for our own mapping purposes that we're looking at the primary world, even though it is now inseparable from the secondary, and that one cannot exist without the other, and etc. And one's not better and worse, or it's not up or down, it is a continuum. But there is one way that you can gauge, if you had to, without taking my word of the three S's, that they have a unique quality about them. And speech, I suggest to you, shares that uniqueness. It meets the requirement. And the requirement is this: primary needs are both necessary and recreational. That is an absolute inescapable definition, because the recreational side is what turns the primary world into the secondary world. And everything besides the three S's, forget the fourth S for a minute. The other three S's are both necessary and then recreational. That is, sex becomes not just a process of procreation and keeping the race going. Sex becomes fun. Eating is not just to keep you alive. It becomes secondary. It becomes recreational. It becomes dining and everything involved. Gourmetting. Criticizing food. You understand? It becomes the primary. Same thing with shelter. Not just a cave somewhere that you can wrap up and stay warm. You get a little money ahead. You got all the sex you can use. You're already overweight and eating good. Dining good, I should say. And you decide what? I think I'll design myself, or have designed for me, a neoclassical cave. I'll be the envy of my neighborhood. So you see, but if you get into the secondary world away from that, then they are not necessary and recreational. If you get into dining, just make sure that you're not lost here. Let's say you get into dining as opposed to eating. Dining is not necessary and recreational. Nothing in the secondary world is. Remember, the secondary world is based upon that which is unnecessary, from the literal sense of staying alive. So dining is not both necessary and recreational. Dining is simply recreational, because you can do without dining. Not eating, but you can do without dining. The three basic primaries that we have been talking about that is fairly well accepted even in the city world, just the continuation of the race of man, but to divide it into some way that is useful. Those three S's are unique in that they are both necessary, that you can't live without them. Humanity cannot live without them. But they can also turn into, that is, they also are recreational. And to begin to see that kind of movement along a spectrum is why I've used different terms and saying there's a difference between sex and romance, or a difference between eating and dining. But now you surely understand what we mean. It's not that we're trying to prove something or that humanity doesn't know what they're doing, but there is a difference. There's a difference between eating to stay alive and eating for enjoyment. There's a difference in screwing, if people understood it, to keep the race going and for fun. But when you get into the secondary world, it's all unnecessary vis-a-vis the three primaries. But notice, speech, whereas up until now, if there was some kind of contest up before tonight, and we're talking about, if I'd brought the same thing, that there is a unique quality to the primary that we'd never mentioned, and that is that it is that the three primaries are both necessary and recreational, and I'd gone ahead and I threw in things like dining and having a fancy home and talking, no one would have noticed. I mean, talk, you would think, was obviously a secondary affair. You can talk or not talk. Woohoo. Tut tut. I suggest to you most strongly, and it's already upon us, but it is not recognized in medicine, psychology, sociology. That's why I say it's a blast from the future, but it's actually already in the past because it's already controlling man's present. And the only way that happens from a three-dimensional view, it's already yesterday's news, but humanity is yet to notice it. Although sometimes I know that you give us credit that some of this almost makes sense from an outside view, this would not. Oh, they could hear it and say, well, I hear what you're saying, but that's not true. People do not have to talk. And then they could start pointing out examples of the number of people in the world who are deaf, dumb, etc. We'll get into that in a minute, but some of you should be well enough by now that you've already grasped what I'm saying. The collective world, the secondary world of man, the civilized life on this planet now, has a fourth requirement. It is not recognized intellectually, it is not talked about, and it would be denied at any psychological, physiological, sociological, religious, almost any level. Right now, if ordinary intelligence was listening to this and took this in some way seriously, and they would listen and say, well, I hear what you're saying, but it's simply not true. Speech certainly plays an important part. It plays a super important part. The more civilized you are, and etc. But to say that it is required is incorrect because we can prove you otherwise. Think about it a second, folks. It is now an operational requirement. There are three S's. Speech is now operationally as necessary for human life as sex is, as shelter is. If you took speech out of human life now, as we mentioned last time, you would be in for an experience that even should I try, you don't hear about. It'd be the end. How about that? Everything would collapse. And there's no need for me or you to stick around this area verbally and start picking at it and saying, well, it might make it harder, it might make it rougher. Take away speech and this is all gone. All of this, you and I staying here together, civilization, culture, the human race as it is now would be finished. And don't bother with saying, well, we could do away with it and still get by with the three S's. We might be back to Neolithic times or back to pre-verbal times. You can say that, but you can't back up. The collective life of man, there is, whatever they call, you're going to suffer severe tire damage doesn't begin to cover it. To talk about backing up. Do you understand? I was taking, again, I was playing the accountant's advocate. An attorney's advocate. That's worse than the devil's advocate. That the mind could say, if it was following this, could say, well, All right, speech is important, I'll grant you that, but we could do away with speech right now in humanity, and it might be a setback. But it would not be the end of humanity. It might put us back to pre-verbal times, obviously, and it'd put us back, and it would run the clock of civilization back 5,000 years, but we'd have to start all over. Wrong. Some of you should smell this by now. You can't run those kind of clocks backwards. You cannot run reality backwards inside that closet. If you could run it backwards, you could run it forwards. There is no way in or out. You cannot run that kind of merry-go-round in the other way. And if you can, it is suicidal. Which is why you can't, because life shows absolutely no signs of being suicidal. None. Well, not as much as most people. Speech is now. And I can make it sound metaphorical if it'll make it easier to slip up on it, or even symbolic. But it is a fourth primary. Modern life, you can surely see, modern life could not survive overnight without speech. And some of you should be able to feel what I just said, that by saying, well, we'd still survive. If it put us back in the dark ages or back in the caveman times, at least we'd be alive. El wrongo. It cannot be done. And so if you're just going to take this metaphorically, you're wrong. I was giving you a few minutes to kind of ease up on it. Life as it is now, and it can't be otherwise. You can't go backwards. If it's going to be any other way, it's going to be forward, which it will be, of course, but it's not going to go backwards. And now speech is as primarily required as sex, eating, and shelter from the elements. It is the fourth S. Once you get a clear shot of this, once you understand, once you look at speech as being now a primary necessity, then why men apparently just have to talk becomes clear as a plastic raincoat. How about all of the attacks, the criticism that people level at each other, all the way from just an intimate level between partners and family to great psychological, philosophical, sociological treatises. People talk too much. Yak, yak, yak. Jesus, why don't people shut up? Once you understand that it's required, and I don't know how many more hand gestures I have to do or talk about other people, you should feel it by now that, God Almighty, I should realize that. No, you shouldn't. But now you should. Once you understand it's required, I mean, you've got to be really a hobbled mental horse to be blaming other people for screwing. I mean, unless you're just not getting any at all and you're just an old sorehead. Or to bitch about other people eating, unless they're taking food out of your mouth, which I don't foresee as any possibility extant amongst any of you. No sane person holds his fellow man in some way responsible for primary activities. That's not the form of criticism. Criticism, remember, only the unnecessary is criticized. So it's only in the secondary world. People don't really criticize each other. You don't get mad if somebody eating. You'll get mad about their manners, or if you're some old sorehead, if somebody says, well, I'm not going to eat unless we go out and do Thai tonight, or do Chinese or Italian. You think, Jesus, what kind of, this guy been out to California and spent 2 weeks, now he comes back. I remember when he used to eat at Burger King and think it was a big deal. Now he goes, I'm going to have to. So it's at the recreational level, that is the secondary level, that people criticize one another, right? It's only at that level that people criticize you talk too much. No one would criticize if you looked out your door in your backyard and there's a guy laying there and he says, food, food. It's like he's starving. But if somebody walks up and he says, I was passing by and I was sort of hungry and I wondered if you had, now it's got to be Chinese. I'm in the mood for Chinese and I was just passing by your house. You'd think, well, you dumb son of a bitch, you don't get my yard. You understand? People do not, the point being, people do not. You just never analyze it, but again, surely you either hear this or you don't. Write that down. Can I get to the heart of the problem? People do not criticize, people do not think in any way that other people talk too much about primary affairs. Of course, people hardly ever talk about primary affairs, but you figured that out already. Once you understand, without any doubt, that speech is one of the primary requirements, it is the fourth S. Once you understand that, then all of these notions that you and everyone else has, which is part of the whole framework in the city, that Jesus, without any doubt, people just, they go on and they talk, they'll argue. Two people be talking about something, I'll sit there and listen to them. Sitting right there, minding my own business, trying to have a cup of coffee there in the Waffle House, and two people be talking about the Mets. They'll be talking about the Democratic Party's present position. They'll be talking about one thing, and one guy will make a point, and the other guy will say, well, I disagree. And the first guy will say, well, no, you're wrong. And I'll be listening, I think, well, the sons of guns, they're talking about the same thing. They're not really disagreeing. Why don't they shut up? In other words, it's like I'm surrounded by yammer, yammer, yammer. It's like the whole world has almost become a talk radio show. The whole world's like become a non-stop commercial. For those of you that didn't like the Kyroot the other night about the guy who, whenever he wanted to be alone, would turn on the radio, that just, silence just swept the room with that one. Once you understand that speech, unqualified, in the same way I'm saying speech, one word, no modifiers, no adjectives. There's no such thing as necessary speech. There's no such thing as that any more than there's, well, there's necessary sex and then unnecessary sex. No, there's necessary use of sex and recreational use of sex, which is the definition of something being primary that serves both purposes. There's no such thing as unnecessary eating. There can be unnecessary dining, but there's not unnecessary eating. So the idea that by any form of criticism of other people's speech has got to be based upon the fact that you still believe that there is validity and decency, I should say, decency to modifiers. Remember that reality where they equate evil with modifiers. There is no such thing as useless talk, and once you understand that, unless you're going to say, well, you breathe too much. I can't stand a man that breathes as often as you do. And I can't stand a man who breathes as often. How often do you screw, sir? I can't stand somebody that would do it once a month. I knew you were a pervert. Damn satyr, a nymphomaniac doing it once a month. It's silly. But once you understand that there is no legitimate modifier to speech, once you understand that it is a primary requirement on the same level, the same primary level as sex, eating, shelter, then any idea that you and life has collectively that men just simply just have to run on and talk, even when it's unnecessary, wrong. Once you understand that it is necessary, what else is there to say? Unless you're going to be a complete buffoon and say, I just cannot approve of people who will eat food that to me has a funny color to it. People who will eat food, I don't know, I just don't like people who will eat food. You obviously see the folly of that. So what criticism can you make of other people eating? Not their dining, their eating. None. Unless you're in another classification that we'll get into, unless you're just irrelevant to life. By the same token, there is no way, once you see it, to ever again have any criticism. There is no adjectives. There's no modifiers legitimately available to qualify other people's speech by saying, well, he talks too much. You're going to have to say, well, you breathe too often. How often do you eat, sir? Not overeat, not all that stuff. Not a criticism that somebody eats too much and they're too fat or they eat too little and too thin. You do not criticize if you're just walking around saying the fact that other people eat. There's nothing to say about it. You don't say, well, you eat too fast. You eat too yellow. You eat too tall. I don't know, you eat too rapidly. You are an astute eater. It's just all ridiculous. It's meaningless. Same way with speech. Once you understand that it is a primary requirement nowadays, you cannot back up. And anyone who is in any position that speech is not one of their primary requirements, they are not part of the mainstream of life, period. That's it. We've made mention of it many, many times in the last few months building up to this. But you might care to take a fresh look at it. This kind of view that we've talked about is considered this way, that the more of a modern, fully civilized, intellectually driven, sophisticated, intellectual person that you are, you generically, the more you need to talk about what you do and who you are. They're inseparable. It is not enough for a person to do something. In the secondary sense now. It's not enough to do something. It is now a primary requirement into the secondary world of not just do something, but talk about it. And the more civilized you are, I'm just using this again to try to help you slip up on it, because unless you are outside the mainstream of life's healthy body, you are subject to this, you're a part of it. But the more civilized you are, the more you must talk. Everybody knows that. I mean, it's right before your eyes, just within the context that's somewhat meaningless overall, but enough to describe it. Everyone's aware of the fact that if you go into a blue-collar neighborhood, or if you're around people who seem to be less civilized in the fullest sense of that word, and as all of you know, it's with no criticism, I'm just using ordinary terms. The less up-to-date, the less modern, the less mainstream, or the less even avant-garde intellectually someone is, the more they are disinclined to, relatively speaking, the less they're likely to talk than is some civilized, very educated person in a certain way. You're just not surprised by it. For someone to be somewhat... And of course, from an ordinary view, they could explain this and say, well, if we're talking about some guy that's over here just a common laborer and he dropped out of the 5th grade and you're sitting around trying to talk, I mean, he has a limited vocabulary perhaps. Perhaps he even feels self-conscious about his lack of education. Yeah. You know, cut it any way you want to. It's still a fact. But where if you go in and you're hanging around tea time at the philosophy department over at the university or any department, you do not expect to go in. You would not, in the same way that you could go around some less educated people, and they might sit around and just kind of do, the talk was limited. They might be inclined to look at the floor, or if there's especially a TV on nowadays, maybe look at it and just every now and then go, yeah. The more sophisticated you are, the more you talk. Not because of the reasons that would be acceptable if ordinary intelligence was listening to this and say, well, it's because they have more to talk about. Yeah, you can look at it that way. You can say, well, people who have more education, read more books, have a bigger vocabulary, they would just naturally seem to talk more. And those otherwise, maybe otherwise. All of that is of very little significance anymore. I just did it to try and maybe give you another chance to look at it in a certain way. It is just simply that every day that goes by, the more and more that life is itself, the collective mass of humanity, the more it is secondarily driven, the less that people must scrounge each day for a primary living, the less that people are driven to spend large amounts of each day looking for food, trying to find shelter, the more that they are part of today, the more that they're part of the level of the city, the more that they're civilized, the more that they are of a secondary trooper in life's march forward, the more they must talk about what they do and who they are. And it's again, from one view, people critique others. A prime example, if you really want to get astute, I wasn't going to go this far, is consider, well, how about the coincidence of this being the so-called information age? As they consider it's just an accepted fact now that the advanced regions of those studying Western and modern technology and the movement of where life is going, that more and more it is the movement of information that is the definitive line. It's no longer a country or an area or a people who are engaged in the heavy industries. You know, who the hell cares? It's almost irrelevant anymore, in a sense. Who is producing steel? Hell, let the Albanians, who wants to do that anymore? We still obviously need steel. We've got to have steel to build computers. We've got to have steel to build the buildings to let IBM and people move in, and AT&T. And yet, nowadays, I didn't make this up. I'm just using what they talk about in the street. That they say more and more tomorrow, the whole thing, if you're going to be in on the modern age, if you're going to stay fiscally viable and all that, you've got to see that the new industry, the growth industry, the growing industry that's going to take over everything, that the heavy industries, agriculture, continues to diminish, and what's exploding is the movement of information, is what they call it. How about this? You don't find it coincidental. I'm telling you, speech is now a fourth primary. Speech. I can call it the movement of energy, of information. Can anybody extract that? Can anybody take away speech? People are required more and more to have almost a running commentary to their own life. The more that you are driven by, the more, and this is all a matter just of relative degrees, and it's of no great importance anymore because the whole world is becoming almost one big AT&T tower. But relatively speaking, if it helps you to see, the more an individual, thus my examples of a less educated blue-collar worker as opposed to a guy with 2 PhDs in philosophy and agriculture and the law. The difference between what would appear to be just their natural inclination and need to converse on a kind of recreational level. Although I didn't hit that to you right in the beginning, I was going to leave it, since I've said it, I'll back up, leave it to you when I said that the speech meets the requirement, the unique requirement of the three primaries, that they are both necessary and recreational. And I point out that speech is the only other one you can find. If speech does serve necessary means, just at a very crude level, that you could not live in the modern world without speech. You could be deaf and dumb, if you want to put it that way. But you've got to realize you could not survive. You individually, you collectively, humanity could not survive without speech. So you can look at speech as being absolutely necessary. Speech could be absolutely necessary if you said, I'm choking to death, what number do you call to get some unchoking help? And you have to ask somebody, and they say 911. So it was necessary. But talk is also recreational. You don't screw just to make babies, you screw to have fun. People talk because they must nowadays to keep the race alive, but people also talk for what? For bloody fun. Which is what irritates other people. Which is what the secondary world is about. Which is what all forms of criticism is about. Is that you find that, wait a minute, the world is big enough for a lot of things, but the world is not big enough for people to stand around and flap their gums like that. They're wasting their time. They're just babbling. How much fun it is to go out and watch somebody else eat? I started to say watch other people screw, but too many weirdos in the world. Some of you might go, yeah. You understand, when it gets to the primary level, to try and to take offense at somebody doing it, we've already pointed out, is ridiculous. You would have to be unstable. You would not be part of the collective mainstream of life. And so the part you do criticize, you're supposed to if you're ordinary, and that is when the primary has turned into a secondary. Well, those people talk too much, or what they're talking about is useless, from my view. They're talking about things that are useless. They're talking about things that don't interest me. This world is not big enough for me and other right-talking people and kinds of people that waste their time. Talk is both necessary and recreational. I just wanted to be sure, since I didn't rub everyone's nose in it to start with. It meets that requirement. That and the other three S's they're it. And speech is yet to be seen as that. Also, I guess I'll have to put a wrap here. But along that same kind of line, once you realize that men are required, the more and more civilized they are, which is all of you, everybody's seeing that, the more you must talk about what you do and who you are. And having seen that, then the part about who you are, what kind of guy you are. Let me tell you about me. You know, people try and talk about a subject, and it's always I. But it is not, once you understand, it is not that they're engaged in some kind of unprofitable, untasty form of perverted egoism. They're just breathing. They've got to do it. At the ordinary level, you've got to do it. A man cannot tell you what he does without some reference to himself. All of you have got to know that by now. Go home and remind yourself, turn on any show, from the president to whatever the latest scam going on in the Donahue show. Men who hate themselves, men who hate other men who hate women, women who hate men who've never met men, children of men, parents who hate women, and and if they start to say, well, I'm here to talk about an important matter, something that's very seldom discussed. And of course, I came to know about this because of what happened to me. And if you start listening a certain way, you can think, well, Jesus, everybody talks about themselves, even experts. We've already been through that. But it's not because anything's wrong. It's because everything is just right. And it's because it is a necessity. It is not an elective. It is not an option for an expert or a bricklayer to tell you what he does in life, why he's alive, without it being self-referring, without him telling you about him. You can communicate without that. It can be a necessary level. But now, remember, I'm telling you that talk is not an option. Speech is not a secondary phenomenon. It is primary, and therefore it is both necessary and recreational. And so the part of people that everything they talk about is self-referring, that is the kind of recreational part. That is the aspect of it that makes men want to criticize one another. You talk too much. You talk about stuff that is useless. You talk when I should be talking. Until next time.